march has been going on for a very long time. And we need to understand how it started, how it's progressed, and how we got here. So we'll just take a few minutes to do a refresher. For those of you that are fresh out of college, you probably are very familiar with classical Marxism. For those of us that are older, maybe not so much. So we'll cover classical Marxism, we'll look at cultural Marxism and how it evolved. And then, as I said, we'll talk about the Long March, what that actually is, and how that actually functions in society. And then we'll talk about something called the Overton window. And it's very important that we understand the Overton window. That's the mechanism that the Long March uses as it marches through the institutions of society. So this graphic is the Marxism ecosystem. And we've used it for a couple semesters. The real intent of this graphic is to show you not just the point at which these ideologies begin, but the linkages between them, because they are all linked together. And if you're talking to someone who advocates for intersectionality, for instance, they may not even understand that the root of their ideology is critical race theory, and the root of that ideology is critical legal theory. So these connections are real, they exist, and you need to understand exactly how they're connected. So that's our intent this morning. We're going to focus on the bubble called cultural Marxism, and we'll talk a little bit about the Frankfurt School. Joe did a good job last week on critical theory and critical pedagogy, so we'll leave that alone. So just a quick refresher on socialism, because that was really the root of all of these ideologies. And it goes a whole lot further back than most people understand. So in Plato's Republic, he talks about elimination of private property, state ownership of children and education of children, and state control of all labor. So that's about the oldest document that we can find that advocates for socialism. Fast forward to the Pilgrims. So a lot of folks don't remember that the Pilgrims started off as a socialist enterprise. The Virginia Company was so concerned about risk that they said the Pilgrims had to actually have everything communally shared among them. So all food, all labor was communally shared. And after about 2 years of that, William Bradford said the colony was about to rip itself apart. So he stopped the experiment. He gave every family a plot of land, and they all went off and became successful. Fast forward to 1789, the French Revolution. That socialism took the form of this radical egalitarianism. So the Jacobins were the political group in Paris that actually kicked this off. And they were intent on making everyone as equal as they could be, and anyone who wasn't equal lost their head. So it was quite bloody. The failure of the French Revolution led to something that's called utopian socialism. So these experiments began in the US, and there were small towns and villages, mostly up north, where they were attempting to create a utopian society. And the example I picked here is New Harmony. So New Harmony, Indiana. And it was stood up by a man named Robert Owen. He was Welsh, he was an industrialist. He felt like he knew how society should function. So he created a model society in New Harmony. His idea, obviously with regard to religion, he hated religion, he was an atheist. So they had freedom from religion, not freedom of religion. He also didn't believe that parents should raise their own children. So children were communally taught and raised. There was no marriage and no private property. So after about 2 years, that experiment fell apart as well. This is typically how these go. But the key for this presentation is Robert Owen, when that happened, he went back to the UK, went back to England, and he established in England what are called halls of science. And these halls of science were actually like churches. They would meet on Sunday. Everyone would come in, they'd hear a message about socialism. They would sing socialist hymns. It was a very interesting phenomenon, very religious in nature. And in Manchester, England, there was a young man who was attending the Hall of Science. And the young man's name was Frederick Engels. And Frederick really liked what he heard in that Hall of Science. So he took a lot of notes, and then he took all of that information back to his very best friend in Germany named Karl Marx. So Marx took what Engels gave him, and he and Engels collectively created the Communist Manifesto. So a lot of that was informed and inspired by the French Revolution, but also by the United States socialism experiments. And then you look at Marxism itself, the terrible toll that it had in the 20th century, 100 million plus dead. Not just Marxism, but Maoism, Pol Pot, killing fields in Cambodia. That's a pretty bloody history. And then there are some continuing experiments in the 20th century. Germany's National Socialist Party, the Nazis were actually socialists. They were more left-wing than they were right-wing. And Israel had the kibbutzim. So you remember the kibbutzes, the little villages across Israel, where everyone thought that they could live in a socialist manner. And those all fell apart as well. So classical Marxism, like we said, was inspired by the French Revolution, by the Jacobins, what they did, all the people they beheaded. Also, US experience with socialism. And then they had debates in college, many colleges across Germany. They had these scholarly debates, and it would bring in these ideas. And as it usually happens, the academia is where these ideas begin to grow and to metastasize. So Marx and Engels both wrote the Communist Manifesto. That's the cover of the first edition. And in that manifesto, he talked about a few things that will sound familiar. So we talked about the oppressed versus the oppressor. In this case, it was class-based. And he called it the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. So at that time, the Industrial Revolution was going full steam ahead. There was horrific working conditions. There was horrific poverty. So there was a lot that needed to be addressed in Germany at the time. But he saw the real problem as the bourgeoisie, the people running the factories. So they had to be done away with. They were exploiting the proletariat. And what he wanted to do was actually go back to pre-industrial artisanship, right? Where the artisans create products and they sell those products. And there is no more factory life. And the only way to get there, in Marx's mind, was revolution. So this is a picture of Lenin, 1917, the Russian Revolution. So Lenin took everything Marx said deadly serious, and he implemented all of those things in the Russian Revolution. And there were three real aspects of the revolution. One was an incoherent mass. So the workers would go from factory to factory, setting them on fire, destroying the machinery, absolutely erasing the means of production. And then the organized mass, where workers would form unions and groups that would facilitate further revolts. And then the centralized warfare was the unification of all those groups into one big party. And that proletariat party would then control the entire country. Of course, Marx believed that the bourgeoisie could not be allowed to live because they were oppressors. So they were summarily killed. Anyone with a college degree, anyone with any amount of wealth, anyone with any position or title was killed. And then they eliminated notions of freedom, law, religion, even the nuclear family. Those were all erased. Those were all oppressor concepts. And then, of course, home education was replaced by state education. Marx famously said, "Give me one generation to educate and I'll take over your country." And he was given more than one generation to educate. Lenin was. And then abolishment of private property, redistribution of wealth. The problem is the revolution happened in Russia and it happened in China and a handful of other countries, but it never happened in the West. And Marxists were trying to determine, scratching their head, trying to determine why it was that the West did not fall prey to the same kind of revolution. And the bottom line is, it was the emergence of the middle class. So as the Industrial Revolution began to wind down, the middle class began to start up. and business owners, small business owners, unions that allowed people to negotiate for better wages and working conditions. So those are all things that stopped the revolution in its tracks. But not every Marxist believed that. And Antonio Gramsci was an Italian neo-Marxist, called himself a neo-Marxist because he didn't agree with Marx on the revolution. But Gramsci continued working. He had to find out why the West didn't fall and how to actually make that happen. So he's the father of what we call cultural Marxism, and we'll talk about why. Gramsci was imprisoned in 1926 by Mussolini. So the fascists in Italy didn't like Marxists any more than the Nazis did. So they locked him up for the better part of 20 years. While he was in prison, he wrote 30 notebooks. So Gramsci's notebooks still haven't been fully translated. They're still out there. But they were full of Marxist analysis on why the West did not fall. And so in those notebooks, he extended class warfare, the way that Marx saw it, to oppressed versus oppressor in every single area of society. That's why we call it cultural Marxism. Every component of a culture can stop the revolution. Every institution, if it's not taken over, can keep that revolution from happening. So what was his approach to the revolution? Well, first it was attaining a position in power, creating a counterculture, convincing the proletariat to reject the majority culture, and then you're able to execute that war of maneuver that Marx really wanted, that bloody revolution. So Gramsci wanted the same end. He wanted a bloody revolution, but he knew that you had to be an incrementalist to get it. And I just threw a note on the bottom there. I was surprised doing research for this that Pete Buttigieg, his father, was a Gramsci scholar. So he was a Marxist professor. He helped translate some of the notebooks into English. And he also advised Marxist magazine. So in Buttigieg's biography, he talks about going to Marxist meetings with his father. He carried him to all of them. Just an interesting point. So what is the Long March? Well, it actually comes from a historical event in the Chinese Civil War, the Chinese Revolution, where the communist forces had to march a very long way to escape from the nationalist forces. But in Gramsci's mind, the Long March through the institutions was the way that you get in and co-opt every single cultural institution. It's that incrementalism that we talked about. And here's a quote from Gramsci himself at the bottom. Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media, by transforming the consciences of society. So while Gramsci was in prison writing his notebooks, there were a number of scholars in Frankfurt, Germany, Marxist scholars, and they stood up what was called the Institute for Social Research. And we call it the Frankfurt School, but they were actually attached to the Goethe University in Frankfurt. And these were all, like Gramsci, scholars that were attempting to determine why it was the West didn't fall and how to make that happen. And so they developed critical theory here in this building. This is where it was born. Joe talked about it. These guys built it. It was designed to look at the West through a critical lens to determine why it is the West, as we said, didn't fall to the revolution. And so I highlighted one person here. There were a number of generations of scholars at the Frankfurt School, but Herbert Marcuse is probably the most important. Marcuse left Germany. The entire Frankfurt School was expelled by the Nazis. And when they were expelled, they came to America, and Columbia University set up a landing pad for them. So all of the expelled scholars landed at Columbia. And then Marcuse taught at Columbia. He taught at Brandeis in Boston. And then he moved out west, and he taught in a number of colleges in Southern California. And he taught at UC San Diego, just as the protests are kicking off on college campuses in the 60s. And Marcuse's view of Marxism and his view of the West, what he was teaching in those college campuses, helped fuel that revolt. And he was actually called the New Left movement's favorite philosopher. So the Frankfurt School made its way to the US and into US academia through Mr. Marcuse. So I thought what we would do, this isn't really an overlay on US history, but it is kind of a narrative from step to step, how the Long March has played out. And you can see in box 1, critical theory is created. And then critical theory had a component called pre-modern narrative. So in critical theory, narrative is more important than fact, more important than objective truth. And so your story, your truth, your narrative. And as that made its way into academia, along with the components, other components of critical theory, it embraced those principles. And then you began to see things like the civil rights era kick off. The legal system created critical legal theory to kind of implement critical theory in the legal area. And then the second row there, you see arts and entertainment impacted. At about the same time, you see the sexual revolution beginning in the 60s, the rise of feminism, the LGBTQ agenda advancing. And then on the bottom row, I believe we've been on the bottom row for probably a few years. And that is intensifying political division, societal institutions under attack, and then civil unrest and anarchy. We've seen that in the big cities for a couple of years now. And nullification and denial. So nullification is the process whereby states and counties and even municipalities determine to do what's right in their own eyes. So they don't follow federal guidance, federal law. Good or bad, it happens on both sides of the political aisle. But nullification is dangerous because of that very fact. Every man does what's right in his own eyes. It isn't constrained by anything. And that is all part of the Long March. That's the mechanism, the pathology of the Long March. That's how it plays out. And the goal, as we said, is controlling the robes of society. So academia, the justice system, churches, legislatures. So this concept, revolution within the form, is a part of the Long March. And we need to understand how this functions, how it makes the Long March more effective. The actual phrase was coined by Garrett, who was an economic journalist. But it goes all the way back to Aristotle. And you can see the Aristotle quote on the very bottom there. It says, "People do not easily change, but love their own ancient customs. And it is by small degrees only that one thing takes the place of another, so that the ancient laws will remain while the power will be in the hands of those who have brought about a revolution in the state." So Aristotle's concept was that you could radically alter a society and change every single institution and make it appear as if no change had happened at all. And that was exactly Gramsci's concept in the Long March, that you could co-opt cultural institutions without tearing them down and completely transform a society. So these are just top-level institutions within the US, and hopefully next semester we'll be able to kind of look at a few of these and look at where they are and maybe what we can do to help right the ship in some of these institutions. So they're not completely co-opted for sure, right? Every institution still exists. Every institution is still doing good things. But the Long March has impacted everyone, and some more seriously than others. So we thought we would just throw 5 examples up. So in the justice system, we're seeing more judicial activism that affects how criminals are actually sentenced. We're seeing restorative justice, where criminals are being released before they should be. We're seeing bail reform. which is causing the crime rate in major cities to shoot through the roof. And then undercharging and deferral of charges. And something that's new to me, abolitionism. So the concept of abolishing prisons entirely would be followed, of course, by abolishing police. So those things are already gaining traction in the justice system. I won't cover academia. Joe did a good job last week of covering those things. Social media, if you're online, you've seen some of these things: viewpoint discrimination, speech restrictions, disinformation screening on social media. Facebook is known for that. Of course, we have a disinformation department now, DHS, so they're going to help us get that squared away. Hate speech restrictions, so anything that does not conform to progressive policy is hate speech. And shadow banning. So online shadow banning is one of those things that you don't know until you know that it's happening to you. And then next week, Brad is going to talk about Fortune 500 companies. And there are a few things going on there. DEI's takeover, so diversity, equity, and inclusion takeover of big business. Financial banning for conservatives, where they cannot conduct financial transactions through the banks. Viewpoint discrimination, and then ESG, which is an interesting concept, but it's an attempt to make companies that don't invest in social justice to the point where they cannot be invested in. So stockholder or potential stockholders can't buy stock from companies that are not social justice aware. So that's being done by BlackRock, and Brad will talk about that next week. And then churches, of course, the social gospel, we've talked about this, liberation theology, and LGBTQ. So every institution has been touched to some extent. So this is the Overton window. And it was an economic concept. It's used mostly in politics today. And you can see the actual window in the upper left. I apologize, that's too small. But think of the Overton window as a way that a politician can gauge public sentiment and then modify their policies based on that public sentiment. So you see the green bar in the top left, and if public sentiment changes, that bar can slide one way or the other. And that is a very powerful process. And politicians do use it to gauge policy. And on the right, you'll see the policy topic of homosexuality. And I thought we would just use this as an example. So number one, homosexuality is illegal. In the 1920s, it was actually codified. Homosexuality was not legal. In item number two there, homosexuality is legal, but not generally tolerated or accepted. And then homosexuality became legal and fully accepted. And then legal, fully accepted, and privileged, encouraged. And then the last item, opposition to homosexuality, is now illegal. So we went from a thing being illegal to opposition to it being illegal. And that was a fairly short period of time. Canada, opposition to homosexuality is considered hate speech. So there are criminal penalties for that. And so this is how the Overton window works. It's a very powerful mechanism. It's tied to public sentiment. And because the heart is desperately wicked, it always trends toward the negative. Public policy never becomes more conservative. It never becomes more godly. And Christians have to operate outside the Overton window. There are so many things in our culture that are acceptable today that are unacceptable to God, unacceptable in God's word. And so we're often in a position where we have to operate outside that window. So what is the ultimate goal? Well, the Long March's goal, as we talked about, was to destroy Western civilization within the form, by using that within the form concept to kind of break down the institutions of society. So you can see on the diagram that there's now an antithesis to these things that we considered generally accepted principles in Western society. So equality of opportunity is now equality of outcome. Color blindness is now race-based partiality. The nuclear family has now been replaced by the government, owning and raising and training our kids. And meritocracy is being replaced by hiring and promotion based on race. So this is the egalitarian, utopian society that Marx envisioned. This rebuilding of this society is happening one institution at a time, one small step at a time. And Christianity is not immune, in fact, because we are patriarchal, we're exclusionary, we're Western. So we have to be deconstructed as well. So spiritual warfare is definitely a part of this. The Long March has a spiritual genesis. Ephesians 6:12 says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." So these forces of evil, the adversary is seeking through the Long March to destroy everything God calls good. And that includes Orthodox Christianity, the family unit, parental rights and education of children, gender, sexuality. We've talked about all these things this semester. But the key to remember with regard to spiritual warfare is we do have the power through Christ to pull down these strongholds. So 2 Corinthians 10:4 says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh, but the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds." So there is hope, and we do have the power to have actually pull down some of these strongholds. So what strategy do we use then as Christians? A lot of folks are talking about how to respond to the things they see happening in culture. And I think it's important that we need to remember that today, in this church and many other churches where we love God's word, where we seek to obey God and worship God, that we are the remnant in this society. We are the remnant. So what we believe, what we espouse is more and more unacceptable to the society. So we have to remember that. Rod Dreyer, who I like a lot, said that we are now experiencing exile in place. We haven't been taken to Babylon, but we are in exile. This society does not accept what we believe. So what do we do? So this is not a circumstance we can fix. This is not a problem that we can repair. This is something that we have to manage. It's a tension that we have to manage until God actually delivers us from this situation. And in much the same way as Israel in Babylon, God has appointed judgment on this society. And while that judgment's taking place, we're not going anywhere. So we have to return to God's word as our guide for all of life. And in every institution that we're engaged in, and looking at an audience this size, you're probably engaged in many of the institutions we've talked about. In every institution, we have to oppose deviations from God's principles. We need to continue to influence the culture. Why is that important? The Overton window continues to shift. And when Christian voices are not in the marketplace of ideas, that window will shift, and it will shift right across biblical principles. And then we need to preach the gospel, no matter what opposition that we encounter. The Roman Christians did that very thing, and that's what we're called to do. Well, I included a quote here from Jeremiah 29:7. Jeremiah's talking to the children of Israel as they've been actually taken into captivity. And he says, "But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." So God was determined the children of Israel would remain in Babylon for 70 years. That was not going to change. So he told them to seek the good of the city where he had placed them. And that, I think, is our calling as Christians. and to help restore institutions. So next semester, we'll talk about all these institutions and not just where they're at, but actually the steps needed to get them back to where they need to be. But the first institution, the most important institution, is the church. And it's the key to restoring all the others. So we have been impacted by the Long March. We talked about this. Social gospel, the New Age movement, LGBTQ compromise, and probably the worst, moralistic therapeutic deism. So that fluffy form of Christianity that says God exists to make me happy, and I just pray when I need things, and that's my Christianity. So no sin, no repentance, no sanctification. So it is another gospel, another form of Christianity, and a large percentage of the church is caught up in it. And then we need to become Bereans. So Bereans hear and they see and they watch what's being taught. They exercise discernment in what they read and what they listen to and what they support. And then last, elders and deacons. Our elders and our deacons are gatekeepers. So God's given us those men for that purpose. They guard the front door of the church, and when necessary, they use the back door of the church. They help defend against false teaching, and they defend the flock from attacks. So those individuals are our gatekeepers in the church. Once we restore the church, then we're going to be a lot better equipped to look in every other institution to try to help restore those.